So when do we start?
Well, we're ready when you are, yeah? Yeah, we can start.
How do I pronounce?
Ilknur.
Ilknur Zer.
What do you think the changes in inflation target?
All right, let's start last session of today's workshop. The presenter is Ilknur Zer. The floor is yours. I think you are on mute. Nope.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, then I'm using the other thing. So you can hear me now, right? All good?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I cannot hear you, but assuming you are hearing me, we tried it, it was working fine. I'm
Yes, we
so
can.
sorry. There is like some very weird stuff happening on my side, on the technology side, and I do not know if you are hearing me at all.
Yes, we can hear
Let
you.
me try one thing.
Yes, we can hear you.
Recording in progress.
I cannot hear you now. Nope.
She's she's joined audio with her phone, but I can't connect to that.
Can you say something? It doesn't, seems not working.
Hello, hello.
Okay, so I guess you can hear me now, but I cannot hear you now. So I don't know what the problem is. The thing is, like, I have two equipment, but one of them is failing all the time. So let me do it this way. At least you can hear me, although I cannot hear you. This is the only thing we cannot do a Q&A, but at least I was going to present. Again, a very big apologies. It's completely on my side. And I guess this is my last time that I was going to do ever an online presentation again. So again, like, and Gianni, thank you very much for filling up my spot and being flexible. My name is Ilknur, and I'm an economist at the Federal Reserve Board, and this presentation comes with the usual disclaimer. And Margot is sharing her screen, so I am hoping that she will going to move on, then we will see where it is. We can go to the next slide, please. All right, so that is the big motivation of the paper. When we started it, and still yet, the sovereign debt receives some attention, especially post-COVID environment. The sovereign debt levels have increased tremendously, and we all know that debt crises are super costly. And this merged with the worsening the world economic outlook, so the high inflation or the low growth levels, that started to, at least the policymakers started to think about whether the sovereign debt is viable enough moving forward. Please go ahead. There is some quote from the IMF managing director, and she's like referring to similar stuff, saying that like more than half of the low income and about the fifth of the emerging economies are at high risk on these debt crises moving forward. Please go ahead. So this is the second part of the paper, if you like. So this global economy is also going through some fundamental transformation, mainly driven by the geoeconomic or the geopolitical developments. So there are some growing political tensions, and this is posing challenges to international relations. And thus, what we are observing is that, like, after many decades of globalization, we started to observe some economic fragmentation. So the economic and political decisions are increasingly influenced by political and or strategic decisions. Thus, this is the term of geoeconomics came into the picture very recently, at least this became in our radar very recently. So this is the definition that we use, at least in this paper, that these existing financial and trade relations are, and the geographical location of the countries and their political decisions are all affecting the economic outcomes, and economic outcomes back this is affecting the geopolitical risks or geopolitical actions. Margot, we can move on, please. And this is the chair Powell's thing, and saying that the geopolitical tensions are highly elevated and posing important risks to global economic activity. Please move on. So this is the research question we ask in this paper. Would a country's international political stance, and I will going to explain you how we define or measure this quantified international political stance, whether this country's political stance changes its external sovereign debt default risk. Please go ahead. So we revisit the determinants of sovereign default, but our focus is on international politics. To answer this question, we construct an international political relations index. I'm going to, again, as I say, give the details, but broadly speaking, this index is covering since 1880s, whenever the data available, for 152 countries. And you can think that a country has high international political relations score, high IPR score, if it has few political conflicts, many military alliances, and politically well integrated with the rest of the world, with the other countries. And yes, this is starting with some bilateral calculations and bilateral relationship between the two countries, and then aggregated with considering all the relations that, let's say, United States has in the world. We then use this index and test whether and why international political relations of a country may affect the probability of a sovereign debt crisis, and whether international political relations, so tight relations with their peers, mitigate the adverse consequences of a sovereign debt default. We can move on, please. So this is the big picture of the findings. We find that high IPR is associated with lower default probability, and this is economically quite meaningful. So 1 unit increase in this IPR, so this IPR index is ranging from 1 to 100, is reducing the debt crisis probability next year by 5 percentage points. And there is a predictive ability, and this is both in sample and out of sample predictive ability. And then we go to the why part, why we are finding what we are finding, and then we show that countries with high IPR scores, so countries with tight political relations, benefit from larger sustained capital inflows. And then conditional on defaulting, that is, if a country, given that the country is defaulted, they rebound easier with a milder credit crunch, and they also face less steep increases in sovereign bond yields. So that is, debt defaults are still very costly. We are seeing like a big credit crunch and GDP loss, and also steep increases in the sovereign bond yields. But these political relations, tight political relations, might be a mitigating factor and reducing the effects of this. And clearly we have a clear endogeneity problem here, and we have some attempts to reduce this endogeneity. I'm going to talk about them now. Margot, we can move on. All right, I'm going to focus on the literature, directly focusing on the contribution. I'm not going to go on to details, but there is a big literature, early literature on the drivers of sovereign defaults. This literature is either silent on the effects of the politics, or they solely focus on the domestic politics, like, for instance, the coup, the effect of the coup, or the how institutional quality of the country is like affecting the default. In this paper, we provide a broad historical and cross-sectional perspective on the drivers of sovereign defaults and the focus on the geoeconomics of international politics. When we go to the second contribution, next slide, there is an emerging yet very limited literature on geoeconomics, and one group looking at the effects of geopolitics on trade, geopolitics on bank lending, and geopolitics on commodity markets. As you see, this is a super emerging literature. As the best of our knowledge, this is the first evidence on the geopolitics affecting the sovereign default risk. We can move on, please. And as the third contribution, we are providing some evidence on the recovery from the sovereign debt crisis. We show that stronger international political ties, easier to rebound with lower economic costs. Please go ahead, and I'm going to talk about on the empirical analysis first how we measure the sovereign debt and the international political relations. Just to remind you again, our question is that whether a country's international political relation alters its sovereign debt default probability. Next slide, please. All right, so the biggest challenge we face here is that the political relations are endogenous. So what endogeneity we are talking here? So instead of international political relations leading to default, a country's default may alter its political stance, right? Like this may alter like how I am related to another country. Also, clearly, some omitted variable that can affect both the expectations on the economic fundamentals, but also affecting the default risk and politics. What I'm trying to say is like we are on a textbook endogeneity problem. So one possible solution, at least we are arguing here, is that using the gravity estimates. So I'm pretty sure many of you are already aware what gravity estimates I'm talking here, especially for the ones that are working on trade. But let me give you the big picture. So there's this gravity model of Frankel and Romer, and they are talking this on the trade. So they are saying that there are some predetermined country characteristics like common language, colonial roots, etc., or the distance between the countries. This will going to be affecting the trade relations, and by using the variation on those predetermined characteristics, I can actually get some exogenous variation. So we are arguing the same story here. What we are saying is that this bilateral relations or like countries' predetermined characteristics, they would not affect only the trade, but they would also affect these bilateral political relations. And also, it would not directly affect the default risk. So, meaning that we need some historical bilateral international political relations, and this is when we come up and how to measure. This is where we ended up with this IPR index. Next slide, please. So this is something super standard, at least for political scientists, apparently, although for me, at least, it was not like these are all the resources that I learned while doing in this project. But in DC, I met with a political scientist who was in a faculty, a professor in GW. When I was talking about this project, he was telling me, oh, you use this, you use that. So apparently quite standard data. So we have these 4 bilateral data in here. The first group is on the militarized interstate disputes. So this is a coding. Number 1, it says that US and Turkey are in war right now in a given year, all going way to number 6, saying that there are no dispute among those 2 states. Similarly, the military alliances. So it's saying that like 0, there is no alliance at all between that 2 countries, going all the way to defense pact, meaning that if someone attacks Turkey, US will intervene also. And then we looked at more like these diplomatic exchanges. The first one is this joint memberships on intergovernmental organizations, and the other one is the diplomatic exchanges. So what does it mean? It means, again, like some coding, starting with that number 1, one country sends a diplomatic representation at any level to another country, going all the way to an ambassador level. So we standardize those series, and then we simply get the average. So tighter political relations, higher the IPR. And when we get the standardized for series, we have some data from 152 countries spanning 1880s. We can go ahead, please. Okay, so this is like somewhat our coverage and also see what the levels look like. This is the data for the last year. So I know it is tough to read, but like higher, the darker the levels, the tighter or the higher the IPR index. And when you see these white ones, these are the places where we do not have coverage. So I think we have quite a good coverage. Mainly, we have missing coverages on the African continent. And what I'm seeing here is that like the North American and European countries have, overall speaking, higher, it's not stability, higher IPR scores than the Asian and African ones. When we look at the country specific, what we see is like Canada generally, like always at the top across many years, and followed by some European countries like Belgium or Netherlands. We can go ahead, please. So this is the methodology. Methodology is quite straightforward. So this is a probit regression because our dependent variable is whether a country I is in a default state in a given year T. And this default data is from Reinhardt and Rogoff. There's the updated version of it. And our main independent variable is this IPR index. The way that we calculate it from bilateral to country level is that we use the GDP weighted averages that the United States has relationship. So this way, we basically take into account whether Turkey has a relationship with US or the weight of the US is different, whether a country has a relationship with US or has a relationship with some small country. So the expectation is that this beta being negative, so that the high IPR is like reducing the default probability. There are some control variables. One of them is that the country's previous defaults. And also we have the government debt to GDP ratio, which is a clear determinant of the default, domestic political stability. So this is like the country characteristics, and inflation, low GDP per capita, GDP growth rate, and trade openness defined as export plus import as a ratio of the GDP. So we run two SLS, two stage least square regressions, because as I say, we, instead of using the IPR index directly, we use the gravity IPR. So we basically use the gravity IPR as an instrument for this IPR, and we run two SLS regressions. Please continue. All right, how to get this IV? So the instrument, we run so our dependent variable, instead of some log trade between country pair I and J in a given year, we are using the log of the political relation of this pair country I and J at a given year T. So we regress it on predetermined country characteristics that could affect the political relations, including the distance between the countries, whether they are sharing common language, border, colony, etc. We try different things, and they're all like having the similar results, and then we get the estimated coefficients. So we are basically relying on the like the deviations or the changes in these predetermined characteristics as an exogenous variation. We can continue, please. Okay, so this is the main result. So when we look at the first two columns, so this is like simple, the main regression equation I showed to you. The only difference is that in the first column, we are using the IPR directly by running simple
5 minutes left. 5
panel
minutes left.
regressions, the second one as a 2 SLS. So the results are similar statistically speaking. That said, the economic impact is higher when we attempt to at least like correct this endogeneity issue. On the next two columns, we were going to see the effect are whether holding for the developed and emerging countries and or the pre 1946, post-1946. This is the Second World War. This is when we can argue like there's a big kind of a structural break in the world economy, both economic and on the financial side. So what we are, I don't know what happened. I'm waiting, no problem. So what we conclude is that results are similar, basically, both economically and statistically speaking, both for emerging, developed, and the pre and the post-war periods. Please move on. We can continue. Okay, then we looked at why those international political relations can lead to defaults. Please continue. And one focus here is on the capital flows. So our argument is that when there are few political conflicts and stronger political connections of a country with their peers, investors will going to receive that country as less risky. When there is less risk, this will going to encourage investors to increase capital flows, and higher capital flows can help the country to smooth the consumption or improve macroeconomic outlook, etc., and reducing the default, as in the model of Gianelli et al. So what we did here, one more step, we also distinguish these long-term and short-term fluctuations in capital inflows, because you can argue that, well, when there are a lot of capital inflows, the countries may also prone to sudden stops, but the sudden stops is generally a short-term fluctuation phenomena, right? So that's why we also distinguish this long-term and short-term flows. Yes, we can continue, please. So in the first column, as you see, our dependent variable is the capital inflows as a ratio to GDP, of course. And in the second column, we calculated this long-term trend on the capital flows. And in the third one, we include the cycle, so those short-term deviations. These trend and cycles are calculated through Hamilton filtering. So what we are showing here is that the countries with higher IPR score, they enjoy larger, slow-moving, meaning that more like sustained capital inflows, and the economic impact is quite meaningful. We can continue. So we have some other results. I didn't want to bore you with like tables and more tables. That's why I was going to go over to them. Of course, the results are in the paper. One thing we did is that whether we can use this as a reliable debt crisis predictor. So basically, we wanted to check the out-of-sample predictive ability. So we run a horse race between IPR, so International Political Relations Index, debt to GDP ratio, domestic political stability, and inflation. These three are the determinants of sovereign defaults that has been shown in the literature over the last 2 decades, possibly. What we did on the horse race, we first calculated the percentage of correctly predicted crises. So what I'm saying is that IPR says a crisis is coming and there is really a crisis, and all the other indices. So the AROC, which is like the signal to noise ratio, so signal to noise ratio, and then looking at the curve, and also out of sample, so the R squares. So what we find is that IPR is the best for the first one, like predicting crisis correctly. It produces similar, statistically speaking, similar performances for the AROC, signal-to-noise ratios, and its out-of-sample predictability is superior than the domestic political stability and inflation, but it is slightly lower than the debt-to-GDP ratio. We can continue, please. On the second group, we looked at the mitigating factors. So what we do here is that like we only look at the cases when there is a default. So this dummy variable is equal to 1 when there is a default, and there is an interaction term, and here the focus is gamma now. So this gamma will going to tell me, given the default, how much the IPR is affecting or reducing or increasing the effect of the default, which is the estimated beta coefficient. The dependent variable is either the log of the credit to GDP, or the GDP growth rate, so basically the GDP loss, or the sovereign bond yield spread. So that is the cost of that, at least like how the cost of that will changes with that. What we find is that statistically and economically, this beta is negative and the gamma is positive. So high IPR countries face smaller credit crunch, less decline in GDP, and less elevated spreads than its peers. On the economic impact, the beta is significantly larger than gamma. So meaning that sovereign defaults are still very costly. We can move on. So we did some robustness. We include some other controls like IMF support, or you can talk about the financial integration, why they're in the robustness because of the sample coverage. So we try some different model specifications, including using different fixed effects. And we use some alternative definitions for domestic stability or the default measures. Next slide, please. Okay, no, we can go back. These are the more details. So overall, I don't know what happened to the conclusion slide. Apologies for that. So this is the overall results I have. I would love to take some questions, but I don't know how I can. One possibility, maybe maybe I can get them written so that I can try to answer, but I understand if it will be too much of an effort. Again, I am very, very sorry for this technical problem, and I'm sorry that, I'm creating a mess for everyone. Please let me know how do you want me to proceed?
Thank you so much. Let's try to, can you hear me by any chance? Maybe not. So if you have questions,
Perfect.
please
Go ahead.
email.
Ask the questions to the floor, and maybe, I can try to answer.
So maybe
I
she
cannot
can
hear
type.
you. That's the problem.
So do you have any questions?
I'm sorry. I mean,
If not,
when I
like,
use the
just
phone
email to her.
audio, I can hear you,
Okay.
but you cannot hear me. But when I open both of them, there is this very weird noise so that it doesn't work.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, let's move on to the next paper. That's going to be the last paper of the last session.